The homeless man outside a Montana diner once carried a wounded soldier through gunfire. Years later, that soldier returned with a secret. Ex-Navy SEAL and his dog saved a teammate. Years later, a farm changed his life. On a cold Montana morning, a tired veteran sat outside a roadside diner with nothing but an old backpack and a loyal German shepherd. Most people saw a broken man. But when an old pickup rolled into the parking lot, a face from the war stepped out. And the secret that man carried would change Garrett Walker's life forever. The morning wind rolled quietly down the Bitterroot Mountains, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and cold stone. Hamilton, Montana, was just beginning to wake up. A thin layer of frost clung to the rooftops, and the pale light of dawn stretched across the empty highway that ran through the center of town. Most people were still inside their homes, warming their hands around coffee mugs. But outside a small roadside diner on the edge of town, a man sat alone on a weathered wooden bench. Garrett Walker leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared across the quiet parking lot. Behind the diner, the Bitterroot Mountains rose like a dark wall against the sky. Their jagged peaks were dusted with early snow, glowing faintly under the slow arrival of morning. Garrett had seen mountains like these before, not here in Montana, but far away. Places where the air smelled of dust and gunpowder instead of pine. He blinked slowly and looked away from the mountains. Beside him sat a large German shepherd. The dog's name was Atlas. Atlas was 8 years old now, his once jet-black coat fading slightly around the muzzle, but his posture still carried the proud alertness of a trained military K-9. His ears stood upright, constantly shifting toward the small sounds of the waking town. A passing truck, a distant screen door closing, the rustle of wind across dry leaves. Atlas noticed everything, but most of all, Atlas watched Garrett. The dog's amber eyes studied the man carefully, as if measuring every small movement. Garrett reached down and absent-mindedly rubbed the dog's neck. "You still got more energy than I do," he muttered quietly. Atlas responded with a slow wag of his tail against the bench. Garrett pulled the collar of his faded green jacket tighter around his neck. The fabric was worn thin at the edges, the kind of wear that came from years of use rather than neglect. His dark hair was cut short, though uneven, like he had trimmed it himself with a pair of dull scissors. A thin layer of stubble covered his jaw. At 39 years old, Garrett Walker looked older than he should have. Lines had formed around his eyes, not from age, from memories. 3 months earlier, he had arrived in Hamilton with nothing more than a backpack and the dog sitting beside him now. The town had noticed him immediately. Small towns always did. At first, people had been curious. A tall man with the posture of a soldier. Quiet, polite, always accompanied by the big German shepherd. Someone eventually asked the question, "What branch?" "Navy," Garrett had answered simply. That had been enough for most people. A veteran passing through. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And Garrett never left. He tried working a few jobs, a mechanic shop on Main Street, a delivery warehouse near the highway, a construction crew repairing an old barn outside town. Each job ended the same way. A sleepless night, shaking hands, a sudden flash of something no one else could see, then a quiet conversation with the employer. "You're a good worker, son, but maybe you need to sort some things out first." Garrett never argued. He simply nodded, picked up his backpack, and walked away. The diner behind him buzzed softly as the neon sign flickered on above the door. Inside, the smell of bacon and fresh coffee drifted out through the cracked doorway. Garrett had eaten there once. A waitress named Linda had offered him free pie when she noticed Atlas lying quietly beneath the table. "Military dog?" she had asked. Garrett had nodded. Both of us, he said. Since then, Linda sometimes slipped Atlas a piece of bacon when Garrett sat outside. Not charity, just kindness. Garrett exhaled slowly and rubbed his eyes. Sleep had not come easily the night before. It rarely did. When it did come, it never stayed long. The dreams always returned. The same mountains, the same echoes of distant gunfire, the same voices shouting through a headset. He could still hear them sometimes. Even now. Garrett closed his eyes briefly. For a moment, the cold Montana wind disappeared. In its place came another wind, hot, dry, carrying dust across broken rock. Then a distant explosion rolled across his memory. Garrett's eyes snapped open. Atlas immediately lifted his head. The dog shifted closer and pressed his side gently against Garrett's leg. Garrett placed a hand on the dog's shoulder. "I'm good," he whispered. Atlas didn't move. The dog simply stayed there, waiting, watching, guarding. Across the street, the small town of Hamilton slowly came to life. A pickup truck rolled past. A farmer stopped at the gas station. Two teenagers walked toward the school bus stop laughing loudly. To them, the man sitting outside the diner was just another stranger passing through. But to Atlas, Garrett Walker was still the same man he had followed through gunfire years ago. Still the man who had carried wounded soldiers across mountains. Still, the man who had once led missions no one else volunteered for. Atlas didn't care that the world now saw Garrett as something else. To the dog, nothing had changed. Garrett reached into his backpack and pulled out a small metal canteen. The water inside was cold. He took a sip, then poured a little into a folded cup for Atlas. The dog drank quietly. A moment later, the distant rumble of an engine echoed down the road. Atlas's ears lifted. The dog turned his head toward the sound. Garrett barely noticed at first. Cars came and went all morning, but Atlas was suddenly very alert. The German shepherd stood up. His tail began to move slowly, then faster. Garrett frowned. "What is it, boy?" Atlas stared down the road. A dusty pickup truck appeared at the end of the street, rolling slowly toward the diner parking lot. For some reason, the dog's tail wagged harder. Garrett watched the truck approach. The vehicle turned into the parking lot and stopped near the diner entrance. The driver's door creaked open. A tall man stepped out. Garrett looked up casually. Then he froze. Something about the man's posture felt familiar. Broad shoulders, steady walk. The kind of movement that came from years of carrying heavy gear through difficult terrain. Atlas barked once. The man turned. Their eyes met. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The wind moved quietly across the empty parking lot. Then the stranger slowly smiled. "Well," the man said, "I'll be damned." Garrett stared at him. It took a moment for the memory to push through the fog in his mind. Then the name surfaced. "Noah?" The man laughed softly. "Took you long enough, Walker." Atlas barked happily and ran toward the man, and for the first time in a very long while, Garrett Walker felt something stir inside his chest that he thought had disappeared forever. Hope. For a long moment he simply stood there in the diner parking lot, staring at the man walking toward him. Noah Bennett looked older than Garrett remembered, but the years had not changed the way he carried himself. His shoulders were still straight, his steps steady and deliberate, the kind of posture that came from years of discipline no one ever fully unlearned. Atlas reached him first. The German shepherd barked once, then circled Noah excitedly, his tail swinging wide. Noah laughed and crouched down, grabbing the dog's thick fur with both hands. "Well, look at you," he said, scratching behind Atlas's ears. "Still the smartest guy on the team." Atlas leaned into the attention with obvious approval. Garrett walked closer, still trying to piece together the moment. "Noah Bennett," he said quietly. Noah stood and stepped forward. The two men looked at each other for a second. Then Noah pulled Garrett into a tight embrace. It wasn't the kind of hug people usually gave in public places. It was firm, solid, the kind soldiers shared after surviving something neither of them ever expected to walk away from. Garrett stepped back first. "You look alive," he said. Noah grinned. That was the goal. Atlas barked again, clearly pleased with the reunion. Garrett shook his head slowly. "What the hell are you doing in Montana?" Noah shrugged. "Funny," he said. "I was about to ask you the same thing." They both looked around the empty parking lot. The small town morning continued quietly around them. A car rolled past the diner. Someone inside laughed loudly over breakfast. To everyone else, it looked like two old friends catching up. But for Garrett and Noah, the moment carried a different weight. 8 years. That was how long it had been. Garrett leaned against the hood of Noah's dusty truck. "I thought you were still down south somewhere," he said. "I was," Noah replied. "For a while." Atlas settled beside Garrett's feet, still watching Noah carefully. Dogs remembered things differently than people. To Atlas, Noah's scent carried years of memory. Noah rubbed the back of his neck and looked toward the mountains. "You remember that valley?" he asked. Garrett didn't need clarification. His chest tightened instantly. Afghanistan. The mountains there had looked different from Montana's forests, but the memory was the same. Rough stone cliffs, dry wind, and the echo of gunfire bouncing across the valley walls. Garrett exhaled slowly. "Hard to forget." Noah nodded. "You carried me out of that mess." Garrett shrugged slightly. "That's what teammates do." Noah laughed quietly. "No," he said. "Most teammates follow orders." Garrett looked down at the pavement. He remembered the radio voice clearly. Command had ordered the unit to fall back. Enemy fighters had appeared on both sides of the valley ridge. The ambush had been perfect. Noah had been hit within the first minute. Shrapnel from a rocket blast had torn through his vest and knocked him flat against the rocks. Garrett could still see the blood spreading across Noah's uniform. "Leave him," the voice in Garrett's headset had repeated. Garrett had ignored it. Atlas had already found Noah by then. The dog had barked once and circled back to Garrett like a signal. Garrett remembered lifting Noah onto his shoulders. The weight had nearly dropped him to one knee, but he stood up and started walking. 5 kilometers, over rock and broken ground, gunfire echoing behind them. Atlas had run ahead the entire way, stopping, waiting, guiding them through terrain that looked impossible to cross. Garrett shook the memory away. "You survived," he said simply. Noah looked at him for a long moment. "Barely." A breeze moved through the diner parking lot. Atlas stood up again and walked over to Noah, nudging his hand. Noah scratched the dog's head. "Still working?" he asked. Garrett shook his head. "Retired." "Both of you?" "Yeah." Noah studied Garrett more carefully now. The worn jacket, the tired eyes, the backpack sitting on the bench. It didn't take long to understand the situation. "You staying around here?" Noah asked. Garrett hesitated. "For now." "You got a place?" Garrett looked toward the mountains. "Working on it." Noah didn't press the question. Soldiers knew when not to dig too deep. Instead, he opened the passenger door of his truck and reached inside. He pulled out a folded map and spread it across the hood. Garrett stepped closer. The map showed a wide valley surrounded by mountains, rivers, fences, fields. "What's this?" Garrett asked. "My problem," Noah said. Garrett raised an eyebrow. Noah tapped the map. My family used to own a ranch out in the Bitterroot Valley. After my dad passed, the place sat empty for years. Garrett nodded slowly. So you bought it back? Last year. Garrett studied the map. It was a big piece of land, hundreds of acres at least. What's the problem? Garrett asked. Noah chuckled. Everything. Garrett looked up. Noah leaned against the truck. Fences are falling apart. Water system barely works. Half the equipment is older than we are. Atlas walked around the truck, sniffing curiously. Noah looked at Garrett again. I need help fixing it. Garrett blinked. Why me? Noah smiled slightly. Because you're the only guy I know who carried 200 pounds of wounded idiot through a mountain ambush. Garrett shook his head. That was different. No, Noah said. It wasn't. For a moment, the parking lot fell quiet again. Garrett stared at the map. The Bitterroot Valley stretched across the paper like a promise. Mountains. Open land. Silence. The kind of silence he had been searching for without knowing it. Atlas nudged his leg. Garrett looked down. The dog's eyes were calm. Steady. Garrett exhaled slowly. You're serious? Noah folded the map. Dead serious. Garrett glanced at the diner, then at his backpack, then back at the mountains. For months, his life had been drifting. Job to job, town to town. No direction, no purpose. Atlas nudged him again. Garrett rubbed the dog's head. Then he looked back at Noah. When do we leave? Noah grinned. How about right now? For the first time in years, Garrett Walker climbed into a truck not because he had nowhere else to go, but because maybe, just maybe, there was somewhere waiting for him. The old pickup truck rolled north out of Hamilton, the quiet town slowly disappearing behind them as the road curved along the Bitterroot River. Early morning sunlight stretched across the valley, lighting the tops of pine trees and distant mountain ridges. Garrett Walker sat in the passenger seat, with Atlas resting calmly in the back. The engine hummed steadily beneath them. For a while, neither man spoke. Noah Bennett kept his eyes on the road, one hand resting loosely on the steering wheel. The tires rolled across the asphalt with a soft, rhythmic sound. Garrett watched the mountains pass by outside the window. Tall pines, rolling fields, snow still clinging to the highest peaks. Montana felt quiet, in a way Garrett had not experienced in years. No sirens, no distant explosions, no radio chatter cutting through the air, just wind and open land. Atlas shifted slightly in the back seat, his ears twitching at the unfamiliar environment. The German shepherd watched the trees rushing past the window, occasionally glancing forward at the two men. Noah finally broke the silence. You remember the valley? He asked. Garrett didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened slightly. Yeah, he said quietly. He remembered. Every detail. The road curved again, climbing higher into the hills. Noah glanced over briefly. You never told anyone what really happened that day, he said. Garrett stared out the window. Nothing to tell. Noah shook his head. There's plenty to tell. The truck continued climbing into the mountains, and Garrett's mind slowly drifted somewhere he rarely allowed it to go. 8 years earlier, eastern Afghanistan. The mountains there were nothing like Montana's forests. They were dry, jagged, and unforgiving. The air had been thin and dusty, carrying the smell of stone baked under relentless sun. Garrett could still see the narrow valley where their SEAL team had been moving that afternoon. 6 men, 1 military dog. Atlas had been younger then, faster, sharp-eyed and fearless. The mission itself had sounded simple enough during the briefing. Intercept a suspected weapons route moving through a mountain pass, in and out before nightfall. But nothing in those mountains ever went according to plan. The ambush came suddenly. Gunfire cracked across the rocks from both sides of the ridge. Echoes thundered through the valley like a storm. Garrett remembered diving behind a cluster of boulders as bullets shattered the stone nearby. Radio voices shouted overlapping commands. "Contact left! Contact right! Fall back!" Dust filled the air. Then the explosion came. A rocket blast struck the rocks just ahead of their position. The shockwave knocked everyone off their feet. Garrett scrambled up again, ears ringing. That was when he saw Noah. Noah Bennett lay several yards away, half hidden behind a rock. Blood spread quickly across his uniform. Garrett crawled toward him. "Noah!" Noah tried to sit up but collapsed again, gasping for air. Shrapnel had torn into his side. Garrett pressed his hand against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. Over the radio came the command. "Walker, fall back! Extraction point is 2 clicks east." Garrett looked up at the ridge. Enemy fighters were already moving closer. Another voice came through the headset. "Leave him! You don't have time!" Garrett ignored it. Atlas suddenly appeared beside him. The German shepherd barked sharply, his body low and alert. Even under gunfire, Atlas moved with complete focus. Garrett looked down at Noah again. Noah's breathing was shallow. If they left him here. Garrett didn't finish the thought. He pulled Noah upright and hoisted him over his shoulders. Noah was heavy, nearly 200 pounds with his gear. Garrett staggered slightly under the weight, but forced himself upright. "Walker, retreat!" the radio shouted again. Garrett switched off the headset. Then he started walking. Atlas ran ahead immediately. The dog moved quickly across the rocks, occasionally stopping to look back and make sure Garrett was still following. Gunfire echoed behind them. Garrett kept moving. Step after step across broken ground. The mountain valley stretched endlessly ahead. 1 kilometer, 2, 3. His legs burned. Sweat soaked his uniform. Noah drifted in and out of consciousness on his shoulders. "Stay with me," Garrett muttered through clenched teeth. Atlas circled back occasionally, nudging Garrett forward before sprinting ahead again. 4 kilometers. The sound of gunfire faded behind them. The extraction point finally came into view, a small military outpost tucked against the mountainside. Medics rushed forward as Garrett stumbled into the clearing. He collapsed to one knee just as they lifted Noah from his shoulders. Garrett sat there breathing hard, watching as the doctors rushed Noah toward the medical tent. A medic later approached him. "You got him here just in time," the man said. Garrett didn't reply. He simply sat there with Atlas beside him. Back in the present, the truck rolled down a long stretch of dirt road leading deeper into the Bitterroot Valley. Garrett blinked slowly, pulling himself out of the memory. Noah glanced over. "You carried me 5 kilometers, Noah said quietly. Garrett shrugged. "You would have done the same." Noah chuckled softly. "No," he said. "I probably would have listened to the radio." The road narrowed as they approached a wooden gate. Beyond it stretched open land, fields surrounded by forest, mountains rising tall in every direction. Noah slowed the truck. "Well," he said, "welcome to the Bennett Ranch." Garrett stepped out of the truck and looked across the wide valley. Atlas jumped down beside him, immediately sniffing the ground with interest. The land stretched farther than Garrett expected. Rolling pasture, old wooden barns, fences running across the hills, but many of those fences leaned crookedly. Some sections had collapsed entirely. Garrett studied the place quietly. The ranch was beautiful, but it was also tired, forgotten, like something that had been waiting a long time for someone to care again. Atlas trotted a few yards ahead, tail wagging slowly. Garrett looked toward the mountains surrounding the valley. The wind moved gently across the fields. No gunfire, no explosions, just silence. Garrett exhaled slowly. For the first time since leaving the military, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt like the beginning of something. Garrett Walker stood beside the old pickup truck and slowly turned in a full circle, taking in the land spread out before him. The Bitterroot Valley stretched wide beneath the morning sky, framed by towering pine forests and distant mountain peaks dusted with snow. The ranch was larger than he expected. Fields rolled across the valley floor in long golden strips of dry grass. Wooden fences zigzagged across the hillsides, some standing straight, others sagging where years of wind and weather had worn them down. A narrow creek shimmered through the center of the property, reflecting the pale sunlight like a silver ribbon. Atlas trotted ahead through the tall grass, nose low to the ground. The dog stopped near a broken fence post and sniffed carefully, his ears twitching. Garrett watched him for a moment. "Already inspecting the place," he said. Noah Bennett chuckled beside him. Atlas always took the job seriously. They walked slowly toward the main barn. Up close, the ranch revealed its true condition. The barn roof sagged slightly on one side where several wooden beams had begun to warp. Rust spotted the metal hinges of the wide doors. A tractor sat nearby, half covered in dust and leaves. Garrett ran his hand along the barn wall. "How long's it been sitting like this?" he asked. Noah leaned against a fence rail. "Almost 4 years." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "4?" Noah nodded. "My dad ran the place for 30 years. After he passed, my sister tried keeping it going for a while. But it's a lot of work for one person." Garrett glanced toward the farmhouse sitting a few hundred yards away. It was a simple white building with a long porch facing the valley. "Your sister still around?" Garrett asked. "Sometimes," Noah said. "Rachel comes out on weekends when she can." Garrett studied the ranch again. 4 years of neglect had left its mark. But the bones of the place were still strong. He could see it clearly. The land had potential. Atlas barked once from across the yard. The German Shepherd had reached the far end of the fence line, where several boards had collapsed entirely. Garrett walked over and crouched beside him. Atlas pawed lightly at the ground, sniffing along the broken boards. Garrett nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We'll start there." Noah smiled. "You already making a list?" Garrett stood again. "Fences first," he said. "Then irrigation. That creek could feed half the fields if the channels were cleared." Noah folded his arms. "See? I told you I picked the right guy." Garrett didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked slowly across the yard toward the farmhouse. The wooden porch creaked beneath his boots as he stepped up onto it. Atlas followed closely behind. Garrett pushed open the front door. The inside of the house smelled faintly of old wood and dust. Sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating a simple kitchen and dining room. A stone fireplace sat along the far wall, its mantel lined with framed photographs. Garrett stepped closer. One photo showed an older man standing beside a line of cattle with the same mountain range rising behind him. Another showed a younger Noah wearing a Marine Corps uniform. Garrett looked back toward Noah standing in the doorway. "That your dad?" he asked. Noah nodded quietly. "Built this place from scratch." Garrett studied the photo again. The man in the picture had the same stubborn look in his eyes that Noah carried. Atlas padded across the wooden floor and lay down near the fireplace. Garrett glanced at the dog. "Already picked your spot." Atlas sighed contentedly. For a moment, the house felt strangely peaceful. Garrett walked toward the back door and stepped outside again. From the porch, he could see the entire valley. Wind moved gently across the fields, bending the tall grass in slow waves. The ranch felt isolated from the rest of the world. Far from towns, far from traffic, far from the noise Garrett had grown used to. "Beautiful place," Garrett said quietly. Noah stepped up beside him. Yeah. They stood there for a moment. Then Noah spoke again. There's something else you should know. Garrett glanced over. What's that? Noah looked toward the far edge of the valley, where a paved road cut across the hills. Some people want this land. Garrett raised an eyebrow. People always want land. Not like this, Noah replied. Garrett waited. Noah continued. There's a developer buying up property around here. Resorts, vacation homes, that kind of thing. Garrett crossed his arms. And he wants this ranch. Noah nodded. Been offering more money every year. Garrett looked out across the valley again. The land stretched wide and quiet beneath the open sky. Why not sell? Noah shook his head slowly. My dad built this place, he said. And Rachel still lives here. Garrett nodded once. That was reason enough. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. The dog's ears pointed toward the distant road. Garrett followed the dog's gaze. A black SUV rolled slowly along the far hill before disappearing behind a row of trees. Garrett frowned slightly. You expecting company? He asked. Noah shook his head. Not today. The wind picked up slightly across the valley. Garrett watched the road for another moment before turning back toward the barn. Well, he said. First things first. He grabbed a hammer from the truck bed and tossed Noah a pair of gloves. Let's fix that fence. Noah laughed. Thought you'd say that. Atlas trotted ahead toward the broken fence line again. Garrett followed behind him. The ranch might have been quiet, but Garrett Walker knew something about quiet places. Sometimes silence meant peace. Sometimes it meant trouble waiting just over the hill. Either way, he wasn't walking away this time. The first morning on the ranch began before sunrise. A pale blue light stretched across the Bitterroot Valley as the mountains slowly emerged from the darkness. Cold air rolled down from the forested slopes, carrying the smell of pine and wet earth. Garrett Walker stepped out onto the farmhouse porch with a cup of black coffee in his hand. Atlas followed quietly behind him. The German shepherd paused at the edge of the wooden steps, scanning the open fields with alert eyes. His ears twitched at distant sounds. Wind through the grass. A hawk circling above the valley. Garrett took a long breath. For the first time in years, the morning felt calm. No alarms. No radio chatter. Just the quiet rhythm of the land waking up. Noah Bennett was already in the yard near the barn, loading tools into the back of his truck. You sleep? Noah called out. Garrett shrugged slightly. Some. It wasn't a lie. He had slept a few hours. Not perfectly, but longer than usual. The nightmares had come, like they always did. Flashes of gunfire, dust, shouting voices. But the valley had a strange way of softening the edges of those memories. Atlas had stayed beside the bed all night. Every time Garrett shifted restlessly, the dog lifted his head, watching him carefully. Now Atlas trotted ahead across the grass, already heading toward the broken fence they had seen the day before. Garrett finished his coffee and set the cup on the porch railing. Let's get started, he said. The first week on the ranch was nothing but hard work. Garrett repaired miles of old fencing, replacing splintered boards and rusted wire that had collapsed after years of neglect. His hands grew rough again, muscles remembering the rhythm of physical labor. Atlas stayed with him every step of the way. When Garrett carried lumber across the fields, Atlas walked beside him. When Garrett hammered nails into fence posts, Atlas sat nearby, watching the tree line like a silent guard. Sometimes the dog would suddenly bark and sprint toward the forest edge, chasing off coyotes that wandered too close to the cattle. Other times, Atlas would simply sit beside Garrett in the shade while he worked, calm and patient. The ranch slowly began to change. The irrigation channels near the creek had been clogged for years with mud and fallen branches. Garrett spent 2 full days clearing the narrow ditches with a shovel. By the 3rd day, water began flowing again. It moved quietly through the fields, spreading life across the dry grass. Noah noticed immediately. "You're bringing the place back," he said one afternoon as they stood near the pasture. Garrett wiped sweat from his forehead. "It was never dead," he replied. He looked across the valley. "It just needed someone paying attention." Atlas barked once as if agreeing. The cattle began returning to the repaired grazing areas. Fences stood straight again. The barn doors opened smoothly after Garrett replaced their rusted hinges. Even the old tractor roared back to life after he spent several hours repairing its clogged fuel system. Day by day, the ranch felt less abandoned, but the biggest change came at night. Garrett noticed it slowly. The first few nights he still woke suddenly in the dark, heart racing as old memories crashed through his mind. Gunfire. Explosions. Shouting voices echoing across distant mountains. But when Garrett opened his eyes, he didn't see war. He saw the wooden ceiling of the farmhouse bedroom. He heard wind moving through the trees outside, and Atlas always lifted his head from the floor beside the bed. The dog would walk over quietly and press his nose against Garrett's hand, just enough to remind him, "You're home." After a week, Garrett managed a full night of sleep without waking. It surprised him. The mountains seemed to hold a silence deeper than anything he had known before. One evening, Garrett sat on the porch steps watching the sunset spread across the valley. The sky burned orange and red behind the dark ridges of the Bitterroot Mountains. Atlas lay beside him, resting his chin on Garrett's boot. Noah walked over carrying 2 bottles of beer. He handed one to Garrett. "You're different," Noah said. Garrett raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Noah nodded toward the valley. "Your shoulders aren't tight anymore." Garrett looked down at his hands. They were rough with dirt and grease, but steady, not trembling the way they sometimes did after sleepless nights in town. "Work helps," Garrett said. Noah smiled. "Yeah, it does." They sat quietly for a while. Across the pasture, cattle moved slowly through the tall grass. The sun dipped lower behind the mountains. Then Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood straight. The dog stared toward the distant road at the edge of the valley. Garrett followed his gaze. A dark vehicle was parked near the entrance gate. Garrett narrowed his eyes. "That yours?" he asked. Noah turned and looked. "No." The vehicle sat motionless for several seconds. Then its engine started. The black SUV slowly turned around and drove away down the valley road. Atlas continued watching until the sound of the engine faded. Garrett leaned forward slightly. "You expecting visitors?" Noah shook his head. "Not the friendly kind." Garrett studied the empty road for a moment longer. The peaceful valley suddenly felt watched. Atlas gave a low growl under his breath. Garrett scratched the dog behind the ear. "Easy," he murmured. But deep down, a familiar feeling stirred in his chest, a feeling he knew well. The quiet before trouble. Garrett Walker stood on the porch long after the black SUV disappeared down the valley road. The evening light faded slowly behind the Bitterroot Mountains, turning the sky a deep violet. Atlas remained beside him, his eyes still fixed toward the distant entrance gate. The German shepherd's ears twitched. He didn't trust what he had seen. Neither did Garrett. Noah finished his beer and set the bottle down on the porch railing. "Well," he muttered, "that didn't take long." Garrett glanced at him. "You know who that was?" Noah nodded slowly. "Yeah." He rubbed the back of his neck. That was Earl Dalton. Garrett waited. Noah continued. Real estate developer. Owns half the valley already. Garrett leaned back against the porch post. And the other half? He's trying to buy it. The wind moved softly through the tall grass in the fields below them. Garrett looked out across the ranch again. 200 acres of open land. Creek water running through pasture. Mountains protecting the valley on every side. He understood immediately why someone like Dalton would want it. Garrett took a slow breath. And this place sits right in the middle of it all. Noah nodded. Exactly. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Atlas suddenly gave a low bark. Headlights appeared on the valley road again. The same black SUV rolled slowly toward the ranch gate. This time it didn't turn away. The vehicle stopped at the entrance. A moment later, the gate creaked open. Garrett watched carefully. The SUV drove up the long dirt road toward the house. Atlas stood now, body stiff and alert. The vehicle pulled to a stop near the barn. The driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out. He wore a dark coat and polished boots that looked out of place on a working ranch. His hair was gray at the temples, neatly combed, and his posture carried the calm confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. Earl Dalton walked toward the porch with a slow, relaxed stride. Atlas moved forward instantly. The German shepherd stood between Garrett and the approaching man, muscles tense, eyes locked. Dalton stopped several yards away. He studied the dog for a moment before smiling. Well, Dalton said calmly, that's quite a guardian you've got there. Garrett said nothing. Noah stepped forward slightly. Evening, Earl. Dalton nodded politely. Mr. Bennett. His eyes shifted toward Garrett. And you must be the new help. Garrett didn't bother correcting him. Dalton looked around the ranch slowly, taking in the repaired fences, the moving cattle, and the barn lights glowing in the distance. I have to say, Dalton continued, the place is looking better than the last time I drove through. Noah crossed his arms. Didn't realize you had permission to drive through. Dalton smiled again, though the warmth didn't reach his eyes. Just admiring the neighborhood. Atlas gave another quiet growl. Dalton glanced down at the dog. Smart animal. Garrett scratched Atlas behind the neck, calming him slightly. What do you want? Garrett asked. Dalton clasped his hands together. I came to make one final offer. Noah sighed. We've already talked about this. Dalton nodded. Yes, but circumstances change. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small folder. Inside were several documents. Dalton opened it and handed the papers toward Noah. $5 million, he said calmly. Garrett raised an eyebrow. Dalton continued speaking. For the entire property. The wind rustled the nearby trees. Noah didn't even glance at the papers. No. Dalton tilted his head slightly. You didn't even look. I don't need to. Dalton looked toward the valley again. You realize what's happening to this region, Mr. Bennett? Garrett remained silent. Dalton gestured toward the mountains. Resorts, tourism, jobs, investment. He smiled faintly. This valley will be one of the most desirable destinations in Montana within 10 years. He turned back toward Noah. And your ranch sits right in the center of the development zone. Noah folded his arms. My answer's still no. Dalton studied him for a moment. The calm smile slowly faded from his face. That's unfortunate. Atlas stepped forward again, sensing the change in tone. Dalton's eyes moved toward Garrett. You're a military man, correct? Garrett didn't respond. Dalton continued anyway. I respect discipline, he said. Structure, order. His gaze drifted across the ranch again. But sometimes progress requires difficult decisions. Noah shook his head. This conversation's over. Dalton closed the folder slowly. Very well. He turned and walked back toward his SUV. But just before opening the door, he paused. Without looking back, he spoke one final sentence. People who stand in the way of progress, Dalton said quietly, rarely stay standing long. The SUV door slammed shut. Moments later, the vehicle rolled back down the dirt road and disappeared into the valley darkness. The ranch grew silent again. Atlas continued staring toward the road long after the engine noise faded. Garrett leaned against the porch railing. Well, he said quietly. That sounded friendly. Noah exhaled slowly. Dalton's been trying to buy this place for 3 years. Garrett looked across the fields. And if he can't buy it? Noah gave a tired half-smile. Then he finds other ways. The wind picked up again across the valley. Atlas lowered his head slightly, still watching the road. Garrett scratched the dog behind the ear. Deep inside his chest, an old instinct awakened. The ranch had started to feel like peace, but now it felt like a battlefield waiting to happen. The next morning, the valley looked peaceful again. Sunlight poured over the Bitterroot Mountains, spilling down across the pastures in wide golden bands. A thin layer of fog clung to the creek that cut through the ranch, slowly dissolving as the day warmed. From a distance, nothing seemed wrong. Cattle moved lazily across the fields. Birds circled above the tree line. The ranch looked exactly the way it had the day before. But Garrett Walker had spent too many years reading quiet places. He knew peace could be misleading. Atlas walked beside him along the fence line, nose low to the ground. The German shepherd's pace was slow and deliberate. Garrett carried a small tool bag over his shoulder as they inspected the northern pasture. When they reached the first fence corner, Garrett stopped. 3 wooden posts had been cut. Not broken. Cut. The wire lay slack across the grass, where cattle had pushed through during the night. Garrett crouched beside one of the posts. A clean saw mark sliced straight through the wood. Atlas sniffed the ground nearby, tail stiff. Garrett sighed quietly. Well, he muttered, that answers that. Atlas looked up at him. Garrett stood and scanned the open field. Several cows wandered beyond the fence line now, grazing freely along the hillside. He whistled sharply. Atlas immediately sprinted toward the cattle. The German shepherd moved with calm authority, circling wide and guiding the animals back toward the pasture. Garrett watched the dog work. Atlas had done similar tasks during training exercises overseas. Different terrain, different mission, but the same instincts. Within minutes, the cattle were back inside the fence. Garrett leaned against one of the remaining posts. Good work, partner, he said, as Atlas returned. The dog wagged his tail once, but his ears stayed alert. Garrett replaced the damaged posts by late afternoon. He didn't mention it to Noah right away. Instead, he waited. Because something told him this wasn't the last problem. 2 days later, another issue appeared. Garrett was repairing the irrigation channel near the creek when Atlas suddenly barked. Garrett looked up. The German shepherd stood at the edge of the water ditch, staring toward the equipment shed near the barn. Garrett wiped his hands and walked over. When he opened the shed door, he immediately saw the problem. The hydraulic line on the tractor had been cut. Oil pooled beneath the engine. Garrett crouched beside it. Same clean cut. Same tool marks. Atlas sniffed the ground around the tractor. Then he lifted his head and looked toward the tree line. Garrett followed the dog's gaze. The forest stood quiet. But something about the silence felt wrong. Later that evening, Garrett and Noah sat at the kitchen table inside the farmhouse. Garrett slid a piece of the damaged hydraulic line across the table. Noah studied it carefully. You think Dalton? Noah asked. Garrett shrugged slightly. Someone wants us busy fixing problems. Noah leaned back in the chair, or frustrated enough to leave. Garrett nodded. Maybe both. Atlas lay on the floor beside the table, his head resting on Garrett's boot. The dog's eyes remained half open. Watching. Listening. Night fell slowly across the ranch. Wind moved through the pine trees along the mountainside. Garrett stepped outside around midnight. Atlas followed instantly. The sky was clear. Stars stretched across the darkness above the valley. Garrett walked quietly toward the barn. Atlas suddenly froze. His ears lifted sharply. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Garrett stopped moving. "Easy," he whispered. Atlas's eyes locked on something near the barn. Garrett turned slowly. A shadow moved near the equipment shed, just for a second. Then it vanished behind the corner of the building. Garrett ran forward. Atlas bolted ahead of him. By the time they reached the shed, the yard was empty. The night air was still. Garrett circled the barn carefully. Atlas sniffed the ground near the back wall. The dog barked sharply. Garrett crouched beside him. Fresh footprints marked the dirt behind the shed. Boot prints, heading toward the trees. Garrett stood and scanned the forest edge. Whoever had been there was already gone. Atlas gave one final growl toward the dark woods. Garrett rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I figured it wouldn't take long." The peaceful ranch was changing. Fences cut, equipment sabotaged, strangers creeping through the night. Garrett looked toward the distant road leading out of the valley. Dalton had made his warning clear. Now someone was testing them. Garrett rested his hand on Atlas's head. The dog remained tense, staring into the darkness. Garrett exhaled slowly. If someone wanted a fight for this land, they had just picked the wrong ranch. For several days, the valley remained quiet again, almost too quiet. Garrett Walker repaired fences during the day and checked the property every evening before the sun dropped behind the Bitterroot Mountains. The routine had become instinctive, something learned during years of military patrols. Walk the perimeter, watch the tree line, notice what others miss. Atlas followed him everywhere. The German Shepherd had grown even more alert since the night they found the footprints behind the barn. His ears twitched at every unfamiliar sound, his nose constantly testing the wind. Garrett trusted those instincts, more than any alarm system. One afternoon, Noah drove into Hamilton to pick up new fencing wire and supplies. Garrett stayed behind to finish repairing the irrigation gate along the creek. The hours passed quietly. Cattle grazed across the fields. The mountains stood silent under a cloudless sky. By the time evening arrived, the valley had turned a deep shade of gold beneath the setting sun. Garrett sat on the porch steps with Atlas beside him. The dog rested his head against Garrett's knee, eyes half closed. For a moment, the ranch felt peaceful again. But Garrett had learned something long ago. Peace rarely lasted. The first sign came just after midnight. Atlas lifted his head. The dog's body stiffened. His ears shot forward. Garrett opened his eyes instantly. Years of training had conditioned him to wake the moment something changed. Atlas stood now, staring toward the equipment barn. A low growl vibrated in his chest. Garrett sat up slowly. "What is it, boy?" Atlas barked once. Sharp, urgent. Garrett grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The night air was cold. The valley was dark except for a faint moonlight spilling across the fields. Then Garrett saw it. A flicker of orange light near the barn. At first it looked small, almost harmless. Then the wind shifted. The flame spread quickly along the wooden wall. Garrett's eyes widened. "Atlas!" The dog was already sprinting across the yard. Garrett ran behind him. By the time they reached the barn, the fire had grown. Flames crawled up the dry wooden boards like glowing fingers. Inside the barn, horses kicked and whinnied in panic. Garrett rushed to the door and yanked it open. Heat blasted outward. The smell of smoke filled the air. Atlas darted inside without hesitation. Garrett grabbed the nearest horse's halter and pulled the animal toward the door. "Easy!" he shouted. The horse stumbled out into the yard. Another horse followed. Atlas barked repeatedly, circling the remaining animals and driving them toward the exit. The fire spread rapidly along the rafters. Burning embers drifted through the air like sparks from a wildfire. Garrett coughed as smoke filled his lungs. "Come on!" he yelled. Atlas barked again. The final horse bolted past them and into the open pasture. Garrett backed out of the barn just as a section of the roof collapsed inside with a loud crash. Flames roared upward into the night sky. The fire painted the valley in flickering orange light. Garrett stepped away from the heat, breathing hard. Atlas stood beside him, panting but unharmed. The dog's eyes remained locked on the burning building. Minutes later, the distant sound of an engine echoed down the valley road. Noah's truck roared into the yard. He jumped out before the vehicle even stopped. "What happened?" Garrett pointed toward the flames. "Someone lit it." Noah stared at the barn in disbelief. The fire had already consumed half the structure. They worked quickly to pull water hoses from the irrigation pump and spray the surrounding grass to stop the flames from spreading further. By the time the fire finally died down, only the black skeleton of the barn remained. Smoke drifted upward into the night sky. Noah stood silently in the yard. Garrett walked around the burned structure slowly. Atlas followed closely behind. The dog sniffed along the ground near the side wall where the fire had started. Garrett crouched beside him. There it was, a metal gasoline can lying half hidden in the grass. Garrett picked it up. The smell was unmistakable. Atlas gave a low growl. Noah walked over and looked down at the can. "Arson," he muttered. Garrett nodded. Neither of them needed to say the name that hung in the air, Dalton. The valley had gone quiet again, but the silence felt different now. The peaceful ranch was gone. In its place stood something else, a warning. Garrett rested his hand on Atlas's head. The dog's amber eyes reflected the faint glow of the dying fire. Garrett looked across the dark valley. Whoever started that fire had crossed a line, and Garrett Walker had spent his entire life dealing with men who crossed lines. This fight was only beginning. Morning came slowly to the Bitterroot Valley. A thin gray haze still lingered in the air, where the barn had burned through the night. The charred frame of the structure stood crooked against the sky, black beams reaching upward like broken ribs. Garrett Walker stood near the ruins with Atlas at his side. The smell of smoke clung to everything. Cattle grazed quietly in the nearby pasture, unaware that anything had changed. But Garrett knew better. Atlas walked slowly through the burned dirt, nose low to the ground. The German shepherd moved carefully between the ashes, studying every scent. Garrett watched him. "What do you think, boy?" he muttered. Atlas paused near the corner of the barn where the gasoline can had been found. He sniffed the ground again, then lifted his head toward the distant road. Garrett followed the dog's gaze. The valley road lay empty. For now. Behind him, Noah Bennett approached from the house. He looked exhausted. Neither of them had slept much the night before. Sheriff Daniel Cross had arrived around dawn after Noah called in the fire. The sheriff was a tall man in his late 50s with a weathered face and calm eyes that had clearly seen his share of trouble. Cross stood near the barn ruins examining the gasoline can. "Whoever did this," the sheriff said quietly, "was careful." Garrett crossed his arms. "How so?" Cross pointed to the ground. No tire tracks close to the barn. He nodded toward the road. They parked out there and walked in. Noah frowned. So you're saying they planned it? Cross gave a dry smile. Son, fires like this don't start by accident. Garrett watched the sheriff carefully. You think Dalton? Cross didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out across the valley. Dalton's got money, the sheriff finally said. And money buys silence. Noah kicked a piece of burnt wood across the dirt. So we just let him burn the place down? Cross shook his head. I didn't say that. He placed the gasoline can into a plastic evidence bag. I'll start asking questions. But the sheriff's voice carried little confidence. Garrett understood why. Men like Earl Dalton rarely got caught. Cross climbed back into his patrol truck an hour later and drove away down the long dirt road. The ranch fell quiet again. Garrett and Noah spent the rest of the day clearing debris from the burned barn. Atlas followed them constantly, watching the surrounding hills. The dog barked once when a hawk swooped low across the pasture, but otherwise the valley remained still. By late afternoon, the last of the smoking wood had been pushed into a pile. Garrett leaned against the fence and wiped sweat from his forehead. You ever think about selling? He asked quietly. Noah shook his head immediately. No. Garrett nodded. He expected that answer. The sun dropped lower behind the mountains. Golden light stretched across the fields. For a moment, the ranch looked peaceful again. But the peace felt fragile now, like glass. That night, Garrett sat on the porch steps with Atlas beside him. Noah stood nearby, staring out toward the road. I'll head into town tomorrow, Noah said. Garrett looked up. For what? Talk to a lawyer. Garrett nodded slowly. Probably a good idea. Noah forced a small smile. I'll be back before dinner. Atlas rested his head on Garrett's knee. The dog seemed calm, but Garrett had a strange feeling in his chest. Something unsettled. The next morning, Noah left just after sunrise. His old pickup truck rattled down the dirt road and disappeared beyond the tree line. Garrett watched the dust trail fade into the distance. Atlas sat beside him. The German shepherd tilted his head slightly, as if sensing something was wrong. Garrett spent the morning repairing a broken irrigation gate near the creek. The hours passed slowly. Around noon, he checked his phone. No messages. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned cloudy. Garrett walked back toward the house. Atlas trotted beside him. He glanced at the road again. Still empty. Maybe the lawyer took longer than expected, Garrett muttered. Atlas didn't respond. Evening arrived. The valley turned quiet. Garrett lit the porch light. Still no sign of Noah. By nightfall, Garrett tried calling him. The phone rang once, then went to voicemail. Garrett tried again. Same result. He set the phone down slowly. Atlas stood near the porch steps, staring into the darkness. The dog's ears twitched. Garrett felt the same uneasy sensation creeping through his chest. Midnight came. The ranch remained silent. No headlights. No truck engine. No Noah. Garrett stood on the porch looking down the empty valley road. Atlas moved closer and sat beside him. The German shepherd leaned against Garrett's leg. Garrett exhaled slowly. The barn had burned. Someone had been watching the ranch, and now Noah Bennett was gone. The valley had never felt this quiet before. Not peaceful quiet. Something else. The kind of silence that comes right before everything changes. Morning arrived slowly over the Bitterroot Valley. Gray clouds hung low above the mountains, muting the sunlight that usually filled the ranch with warmth. The valley felt still, almost heavy, as if the land itself was waiting. Garrett Walker stood on the porch holding a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Atlas sat beside him, watching the empty road. Noah Bennett had not returned. Garrett had slept only a few hours during the night, waking repeatedly to check the driveway. Each time he stepped outside, the valley had looked exactly the same. Quiet. Empty. Atlas had followed him every time. Now the dog sat calmly beside him, though his ears remained alert. Garrett rubbed the back of his neck and stepped down from the porch. "Let's check the place," he muttered. Atlas stood immediately. They walked slowly across the ranch yard toward the burned remains of the barn. The blackened structure looked even worse in the gray morning light. Ash covered the ground where the fire had consumed the wood beams, leaving only twisted metal and charred posts. Garrett stopped near the ruins. "Still can't believe that happened," he said quietly. Atlas sniffed the ground, then lifted his head toward the house. Garrett turned. The farmhouse door stood slightly open. Garrett frowned. He was certain he had closed it the night before. Atlas walked toward the house cautiously. Garrett followed. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots as he stepped inside. The kitchen looked exactly as it had the evening before. Coffee pot on the counter. 2 empty chairs at the table. Nothing out of place, but something new sat in the center of the table. A white envelope. Garrett stepped closer. Atlas moved beside him, sniffing the air. The envelope had Garrett's name written across the front in simple black ink. Garrett Walker. Garrett picked it up slowly. The handwriting looked familiar. He opened the envelope and pulled out several folded documents. At first, the pages meant nothing. Legal language, property records, official stamps. Then Garrett saw the name printed across the top line. Owner of record. Garrett Walker. Garrett blinked. He turned the page. The same name appeared again and again. The entire ranch. 200 acres of land. The house, the fields, the cattle. Everything. Transferred legally to Garrett Walker. Garrett lowered the papers slowly. Atlas sat quietly beside him. At the bottom of the envelope lay one final sheet of paper. A handwritten note. Garrett unfolded it. The writing was unmistakable. Noah's. Garrett, if you're reading this, then you've probably already figured out what happened. I know you well enough to understand something. You never would have accepted help. Not directly. You would have said you didn't deserve it. So I had to find another way. The ranch was never meant for me. It was always meant for you. You carried me 5 kilometers through a war zone when everyone else said it couldn't be done. You gave me the rest of my life. Compared to that, this land is nothing. You needed a place to stand again. A place where the war couldn't follow you. So I made sure you found one. Take care of the ranch. Take care of Atlas. And most of all, take care of yourself. You earned this life a long time ago. Noah Garrett lowered the letter. For a long moment, he didn't move. The kitchen remained completely silent. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Atlas walked closer and pressed his head softly against Garrett's leg. Garrett looked down at the dog. "You knew something, didn't you?" he murmured. Atlas wagged his tail once. Garrett walked slowly to the window. From there, he could see the entire ranch, the pastures, the creek, the mountains rising tall beyond the valley. All of it. His. The realization settled slowly in his chest. Noah had planned everything. The job, the repairs, the months of work rebuilding the ranch, even his sudden disappearance. Garrett leaned against the window frame. For years he had drifted through life with no direction, no place to belong. Now, suddenly, the valley stretched before him like an open road. Atlas barked softly. Garrett looked down at the documents again. 200 acres. A ranch that needed protecting. Garrett folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Then he walked outside. The wind moved across the fields, bending the tall grass in long waves. Garrett rested his hand on Atlas's head. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like we've got a ranch to run." The wind moved across the Bitterroot Valley, carrying the scent of pine and fresh earth through the open fields. Garrett Walker stood on the porch with Atlas beside him, both of them looking out across the land that now belonged to them. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The valley stretched wide and quiet beneath the mountains. 200 acres, a ranch that needed rebuilding, and a life Garrett had never expected to have. Atlas barked once as if reminding him the work had already begun. Garrett smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said, scratching the dog behind the ear. "Let's get started." The first weeks were difficult. Running a ranch alone meant long days and longer nights. Garrett repaired fences, rebuilt the burned barn frame, and spent hours maintaining the irrigation channels that fed the pastures. Atlas worked beside him every day. The German Shepherd seemed to understand the importance of the land. He patrolled the property constantly, watching the tree line and guiding cattle back into place whenever they wandered too far. Slowly, the ranch began to breathe again. The fields turned greener as water returned to the soil. New wooden beams replaced the charred remains of the barn. The quiet valley started to feel alive. But Garrett knew something else. 200 acres was too much work for one man. One evening, he drove into Hamilton and stopped at a small community center where local veterans sometimes gathered. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old leather chairs. A handful of men sat around a long table talking quietly. Garrett recognized the look in their eyes immediately. The same look he had seen in the mirror for years. Men who had come home from war, but never quite left it behind. Garrett stepped forward. "My name's Garrett Walker," he said. Several heads turned. "I've got a ranch outside the valley," he continued. "It needs help." The room stayed quiet. Garrett continued. "I'm not offering charity." He paused. "I'm offering work." One of the men leaned forward, a tall veteran with gray streaks in his beard. "What kind of work?" he asked. Garrett smiled slightly. "The kind that keeps your hands busy and your mind quiet." The next morning, 2 trucks followed Garrett back to the ranch. The first man to arrive was Daniel Carter. Daniel had served as an Army combat engineer years earlier. His shoulders were broad, but his movements carried a stiffness that hinted at old injuries. Atlas approached him carefully. Daniel hesitated at first. Then he knelt and let the dog sniff his hand. Atlas wagged his tail. "Guess I passed the inspection," Daniel said with a small grin. Garrett nodded. "Atlas has good instincts." Over the following weeks, more men arrived. Marcus Hill came next, a former Marine logistics specialist with a calm voice and steady hands. Then came Tyler Grant, a quiet man who had spent years as an Army medic. Each of them carried scars no one else could see, but the ranch gave them something to focus on. Work started at sunrise every day. Daniel repaired irrigation pipes and reinforced the barn structure. Marcus managed the cattle, moving them between pastures with patient precision. Tyler handled equipment repairs and helped maintain the machinery Garrett relied on. Atlas became the heart of the ranch. The German Shepherd greeted every new arrival with quiet curiosity. He followed the men as they worked, often sitting beside whoever needed company the most. Some evenings, one of the veterans would sit quietly on the porch with Atlas resting his head against their knee. The dog seemed to know when someone needed that. The ranch slowly became something different. Not just a place of work, a place of healing. Months passed. The burned barn was rebuilt stronger than before. The cattle herd doubled. Visitors occasionally drove down the valley road to see the unusual ranch run entirely by veterans. One afternoon, Garrett stood beside the new barn watching the men work in the pasture. Daniel hammered new boards along the fence line. Marcus guided a small group of cattle toward the creek. Tyler repaired a tractor engine near the shed. Atlas trotted across the field, inspecting everything like a silent supervisor. Garrett leaned against the fence. For the first time in years, the war felt far away. The valley had given him something he never expected: purpose. And the ranch had become more than just land. It had become a second chance. Atlas barked suddenly. Garrett looked toward the valley road. A pickup truck appeared in the distance, slowly rolling toward the ranch gate. The faded blue paint looked familiar. Garrett felt a slow smile spread across his face. Atlas barked again and sprinted toward the road. Garrett straightened as the truck approached. Some journeys ended quietly. Others came full circle. The pickup truck rolled slowly down the long dirt road toward the ranch. Dust rose behind its tires as it passed the wooden gate and entered the valley. Atlas reached the truck first. The German shepherd sprinted across the field, barking excitedly, his tail wagging wildly. Garrett Walker stood near the fence watching the vehicle approach. He already knew who it was. Some things a man just recognized. The truck came to a stop beside the barn. The driver's door opened. Noah Bennett stepped out. For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind moved gently across the valley, bending the tall grass around them. Atlas jumped up beside Noah, barking happily as the man knelt down to greet him. "Well, look at you," Noah said, laughing softly. He scratched behind Atlas's ears. "You're still running the place, huh?" Atlas wagged his tail harder. Garrett walked toward them slowly. Noah stood up. They studied each other for a moment. Months had passed since the last time they had seen one another, but the understanding between them remained exactly the same. Garrett stopped a few feet away. "You took your time," he said. Noah shrugged. "Had to make sure you wouldn't chase me down and give the ranch back." Garrett laughed quietly. "Too late for that now." Noah looked past him toward the fields. The ranch had changed. Where broken fences once stood, strong wooden rails now lined the pastures. The rebuilt barn stood tall and sturdy against the mountains. Cattle moved across the green fields, and several men worked along the far fence line repairing equipment. Noah studied the scene carefully. "You did all this?" he asked. Garrett shook his head. "Not alone." He gestured toward the pasture. Daniel Carter raised a hand in greeting. Marcus Hill leaned against the fence beside him. Tyler Grant waved from the tractor near the creek. Veterans. Men who had once been lost in the same quiet battles Garrett had fought inside himself. Noah nodded slowly. "Looks like you built more than a ranch." Garrett crossed his arms. "Turns out a lot of people needed a place to start over." Atlas walked between the two men, sitting calmly beside Garrett now. The German shepherd looked from one man to the other, satisfied. Noah looked down at the dog. "Still watching over everyone," he said. Garrett smiled slightly. "He's better at it than most people." They walked together toward the barn. The afternoon sun hung low above the Bitterroot Mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Noah glanced toward the horizon. "Dalton ever come back?" he asked. Garrett shook his head. "Sheriff Cross paid him a visit after the fire." Noah raised an eyebrow. "And?" Garrett shrugged. "Seems Dalton decided this valley wasn't worth the trouble." Noah smiled faintly. "Good." They reached the barn and leaned against the wooden fence. Atlas lay down beside them, resting in the warm grass. The valley looked peaceful again. Not the fragile peace from before, but something stronger. A life rebuilt from hard work and quiet determination. Garrett looked out across the fields. For years he had believed the war had taken everything from him. His purpose, his direction, his future. But standing there in the valley, he realized something else. Sometimes life didn't end when you thought it had. Sometimes it simply changed direction. Noah looked toward him. "You all right?" he asked. Garrett nodded slowly. "Yeah." He looked down at Atlas. The dog's amber eyes reflected the golden sunlight. Garrett scratched the top of the German shepherd's head. "I think we're finally home." The sun dipped lower behind the mountains. Warm light spread across the ranch one last time before evening settled over the valley. Men continued working along the fences. Cattle moved quietly through the grass, and Atlas stood beside Garrett Walker, watching over the land they now protected together. For the first time in a very long time, Garrett Walker felt something he thought he had lost forever. Peace. If you believe every veteran deserves a place to stand and start again, type yes in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. And if stories about loyalty, courage, and protecting the land still mean something to you, go ahead and subscribe. There are more stories like this waiting down the road.